I wanted to let you know about a campaign that I'm taking part in called hashtag 2Pods a Day. It's designed to introduce you to 2 independent podcasts every day for the month of July. We hope to give visibility to some great indie podcasts that you probably haven't heard of. Hashtag 2Pods a Day encourages you to listen more, listen indie. Find more shows like mine by following hashtag 2Pods a Day on Twitter and on Facebook. When you get together with your brother or sister, is there a family road trip that you still talk about the most?
That's funny because we went on so many road trips to so many different destinations. I think the one that we always come back to is the one that I actually opened my book with, where we spun out on a highway in nowhere, Indiana. It was probably, 6 or 7 a.m. in the morning, and we were just one of about 40 or 50 cars that hit a patch of black ice and spun out. And luckily, I don't think anybody collided into each other, but we all kind of slid into a ditch in thigh-high snow. And we had to wait for a fleet of tow trucks to come and pull our land yachts out of the median or out of the ditch along the interstate. And we just kind of had to sit there and we played games. It was almost like we were camping. We played games, we sang songs, we ate what little food we had, and we kind of just had a great old time together as a family as we waited for this fleet of tow trucks to come rescue us. So that was just about the most memorable start to a family road trip I think you could have.
I'm Tim O'Brien. In this episode of the Shaping Opinion podcast, we're joined by Richard Ratay. He's the author of a new book called Don't Make Me Pull Over, an informal history of the family road trip. The premise of our podcast is simple. We talk about people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Today we're going to talk with Rich about the story behind roadways that have brought us together across the country, and if we're lucky, in some cases, they brought our families together. Richard, today we're going to talk about some of your great memories of family road trips and also the highway system that was built not that long ago that brought our country within reach and our families closer together. But when I looked at your background, I noticed that you're a veteran of advertising and marketing. Can you tell us more about your professional background and how you tapped that when you evolved into becoming a book author?
Yeah, sure. Well, so as you know, my background is as a copywriter and creative director in advertising. So kind of like what Don Draper did actually in Mad Men, for those who have seen that TV series, although on a slightly smaller scale because I predominantly worked in Milwaukee and in Philadelphia in my advertising career. But I worked with a lot of tourism clients, so I was certainly exposed to advertising for different destinations and airlines and things of that nature. Of course, in that particular field, I spent my whole career writing 60-second radio ads and 30-second TV spots and short ads with catchy, clever headlines. So writing a book like this, where I had 80,000 to 100,000 words to tell my story, was a very different challenge for me, and I found it to be an ongoing challenge throughout the writing process. Although I think, Tim, you're one who's read the book, and I think it's easy to tell that, there's all these stories that I tell in a very short and succinct way. And in that way, my background in writing like short TV ads was good preparation for writing a book of this nature.
Your book is as much a memoir as it is a history of our country. How would you describe it? Is it more of a history of the country or a personal memoir?
Yeah, I call it a pop history memoir. Because you're right, it's a hybrid of several different styles. I use my family's stories as kind of a springboard to get into this history and background of so many things about the great American road trip experience. Things like how America got its interstate highway system, how we got things like CB radios and 8-track tape decks and those great games that we played in the back seat of our cars. And why our station wagons had fake wood paneling on their sides, right? I found the research in preparation for doing this book to be so fascinating. I stumbled upon one great story or one great historical nugget after another. And at the end of doing basically a year's worth of research before ever, setting pen to paper to write this book, I knew I had the stuff to write a great book, and that it would have to feature a lot of history as well as my family's personal stories.
That is one of the unique things about this book. When I saw the cover of your book, I thought this was a personal memoir. But as I read it, you really did encompass some of the history of the country, and I'm going to go back over some of that right now. On June 29th, 1956, President Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956. This created a 41,000-mile, what he called a national system of interstate and defense highways that the president said would get rid of unsafe and inefficient roads, reduce traffic gridlock, and enable better transcontinental travel. This was at the height of the Cold War, and kids in schools were conducting drills on what to do in the event of a nuclear attack on America. And a big argument was made that in the case of an atomic attack on our key cities, we would need a better way to evacuate those cities. In other words, the creation of interstates wasn't just done for the convenience or commerce, but for national security. So in your book, Rich, you remind us that the changes in the American society also contributed to the road trip craze. More families had cars, workers had more time on their hands and bigger paychecks because of the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, and labor unions introduced the 40-hour work week, so vacation clauses in some of those contracts gave Americans more time to travel. Also, after World War II, 7 million soldiers were discharged 2 years right after World War II. That's what you describe. And they discovered travel while they were overseas, and they brought that back here.
Yeah.
These were some of the changes. What were some of the other changes, Rich?
I mean, obviously, it was kind of a societal and cultural preparation for going on all these road trips. As you said, many, the roots of the road travel boom of the 1950s and 60s and 70s can really be traced back to World War II in so many ways, because it was the draft and enlistment that swept all these young men off their farms and out of their urban neighborhoods and sent them off to train in different areas of the country, and in particular Florida. The U.S. military had established more than 170 military installations in the state of Florida alone. And of course, not only did these soldiers train in Florida, many of them were based there. So when they were on leave, they got a chance to visit many of these Florida beaches. And so for many of these young men, it was their first chance to see life beyond the familiar surroundings of their family farm or the urban neighborhood where they were raised. And they decided they liked it. They wanted to get out there and discover their country and, to a lesser aspect, the entire world that was out there beyond the borders of their farm. So that's really what inspired the travel bug. Of course, it was also a time of tremendous economic prosperity after World War II, as you pointed out. All of a sudden, these young men found themselves with much more time and money on their hands. Of course, they were starting families en masse. That's what led to the baby boom. So they had children, money, time, and plenty of cars, because American factories also made a quick and easy transition from producing warplanes and tanks and jeeps and things of that nature for the war to going back and producing vast numbers of cheap, high-quality American automobiles in greater numbers than they ever did before. So all this stuff kind of precipitated and set the table for this road travel boom. And by the time Eisenhower came along in 1956, there had already been a grand plan for an articulated network of interstate highways laid out in the 1930s. Of course, America wasn't able to act on it until we got through World War II. But that had really been all laid out. What Eisenhower was really a champion for leading the charge to fund the interstate highways. And of course, he was a big proponent of the interstates, having seen what the Autobahn had done for Germany in being able to help facilitate moving the military around very quickly and easily, and also what it did for Germany from a commerce standpoint. So he was a big proponent of building these interstate highways. But it was a massive, massive project. In fact, it was the most expensive peacetime project in the history of the world. And of course, it took far longer and was far more expensive for America to build than anybody really foresaw. I think when the Federal Aid Act was passed, it had budgeted $30 billion and projected it would take 10 years to build America's interstate highway system. Of course, those projections were just a trifle off. It actually cost something more like $130 billion and took more than 20 years, really 25 years. It was into the 1980s that America's interstate highway system was really completed. So, at the time I was out traveling the interstates with my family and with my siblings during the 1970s, really America was still at work building them. And of course, once the interstates were built, it was a fundamental transformation of America. It took this huge country, one of the biggest countries on earth, and made it so much smaller. In one fell swoop, all of a sudden, all these places, all these destinations that Americans could once only read about in newspapers and magazines, now they could actually travel to in a matter of a few days, given ownership of a car and a few dollars for gasoline and a few days off to make the trip. So it was a fundamental transformation of America.
Today we have 250 million vehicles in the United States, and they have access to the interstate highway system that's now 46,000 miles long. The roads are still used for travel and leisure, but they're vital to our daily living, carrying goods and services to our doorstep. Even today, when we look at Amazon and all the other new technologies and new trends that we have, they still rely on those same roads. The roads were first popularized for trips to places like Yellowstone Park and Civil War battlefields. And now I want to really turn it to your family, Rich. Can you remember some of those destinations, some of the places that you went to that still stick out in your mind?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, my father was a very avid golfer, and we lived in Wisconsin near Milwaukee, which is where I still live to this day. Actually, I moved back here. I spent about 5 years in Philadelphia, but we eventually moved back here. So the point of many of our road trips, almost all of our road trips while I was growing up, was to get my father out of the Wisconsin winter and down south to a warm and sunny golf course as fast as humanly possible. So most of our destinations were along the Gulf Coast. We traveled to around New Orleans and Louisiana, Mississippi, that area a lot, which is in fact where my parents first met while out on their own individual road trips. So I guess it was predestined that we would be a road trip family. But we also would go to the Florida Panhandle and actually both coasts of Florida, St. Augustine. Of course, we got to Walt Disney World, like so many families in the 1970s after it opened in 1971. And then in the later years of the 1970s and 1980s, we began traveling east more. We would go to places like the Gettysburg battlefield, Washington, D.C., Savannah, Georgia. But we actually rarely traveled west of the Mississippi. So almost all of our travels went to the southern U.S. and to the east and southeast.
You describe your dad quite a bit in the book, and you mentioned that he spent a lot of time on the golf course. What did the family do while he was out on the golf course?
Well, most often, our destinations were to be found by my father in the back of his golf magazines. We would often make our final destination many of these golf resorts that he would get special deals to go visit, with the agreement that he would take a look at a condominium or, consider joining that club or whatever down there. But in many ways, these golf resorts were actually ideal final family destinations. They often had fishing holes and tennis courts and lots of swimming pools spread out over the property. Sometimes they would have horse stables and yacht clubs and things of that nature. So there were all sorts of things for us kids to see and do. And then, of course, we would make these side trips into, nearby places of interest, such as the city of New Orleans, which we went to several times, or we'd make it to the beach along the Gulf Coast. So there were always things in it for the family, even though many of our destinations were predominantly to appease my avid golfer father.
One of the things we always remember about our trips over the years, even as adults, is the food that we ate when we went to some places. Are there certain restaurants or are there certain dishes that you remember over the years that stick out from those family road trips?
Oh, especially from the occasions that we went into New Orleans. We were exposed to all different kinds of foods that, we would have never had, back home in Milwaukee. So, we were exposed to things like boiled peanuts, boiled crawdads, which are crayfish. They're boiled crayfish, basically. And, how they'd say them in that thick southern drawl, of course, was that they were bald crawdads. So it sounded like we were eating, hairless crustaceans of some sort. But they were actually pretty good. They taste a little bit like little bites of lobster. We would have things like po' boys, pralines. Of course, we went to the famous Café du Monde and had beignet donuts for the first time. We were exposed to Southern soul food in many of the places that we went. So, it really did broaden my horizons as a child, as an 8 or 10-year-old, trying these different foods and hearing these people talk in ways that were very different than what I was used to, seeing things like Spanish moss on the trees. It was really eye-opening for, a child my age and coming from suburban Milwaukee to see and be exposed to all these different things. And that's part of the benefits of travel, especially when you're so young.
Well, those were some of the benefits of the destinations, but as they say, sometimes it's the journey that you remember so well. That story you told at the beginning, I really liked the way you described your mother, because you talked about how she responded to that collision with a snowdrift. Can you describe your mother's role, not only in that situation, but what was her role in all of the road trips?
Yeah, it's funny because my father was such the driving force and behind our family road trips. Of course, being the one that was predominantly behind the steering wheel. But my mother was so essential in so many ways because she was always the one that was kind of a buffer, first of all, between my father and the kids. My father was all about making time, getting to our day's destination as fast as humanly possible. And if that meant skipping meals or ignoring our pleas to pull over so that we could use a restroom, that didn't bother him too much. So we very much had to count on Mom as being kind of our mediator at times to convince him to do things that he didn't necessarily want to do. But she was also the one that would often plan to bring along some snacks for us. She, of course, had the game bag, which I talk about extensively in the book, a large paper sack filled with all sorts of games and diversions, particularly for me being by far the youngest of the 4 kids in the car. And so, she would pack that game bag full of games like the Woolly Willy, where you use the magnet to pull, black metal shavings onto a cartoon face and create beards and mustaches and funny haircuts on top of Willy. There would be the license plate bingo games in there and my comic books and all sorts of things. So she would always have that prepared for us. And she was always, the one that was kind of looking out for the needs and concerns of us as the children in the car. So she had a very important role.
I think the best term that surprised me, actually, but it was a very apt description of her, was after the car wrecked into that snowdrift, you described her as turning on crisis management mode.
Right, yeah. She was the one that immediately began planning for our survival. Well, here we were, a family stranded in a snowdrift in nowhere, Indiana, and she's the one that immediately began asking, particularly my older brothers, whether they had any extra candy bars packed, because she didn't know how she was going to have to handle rations at that point. She was the one telling my dad to turn the car off because we would need to reheat the car, at certain intervals if we were going to be stuck in this ditch in basically, maybe not sub-zero, but close to sub-zero temperatures while out in Indiana. So she was already, immediately formulating this survival plan, basically, for us as soon as things went south. So, yeah, she was, like I said, the one who was always looking out for the concerns of the family. If my dad was the engine, Mom was the steering wheel, always keeping us headed in the right direction.
How did your road trips make you and your family closer?
Oh my gosh, it's just the long hours that you spend together as a family on the road, having to negotiate with each other and make compromises. Of course, sometimes, you have those squabbles and your fights about, whose foot is on whose side and who's touching who. But in the end, having those fights kind of brings you closer. Of course, we spent many hours playing games together, certainly the traditional family games like the alphabet game and license plate bingo, but a particular favorite for my family was also playing those Mad Libs, using those Mad Libs books, which were created by the same zany minds as behind Mad Magazine. Those were basically short stories with blanks left out, and whoever had the book would solicit suggestions from everyone else in the car for different adjectives or animals or just about everything, and then they would be put completely out of context back into that story. And at the end, whoever had the book would then read the completed story with all of those out of context suggestions put into the text of the story. And so often they would just be absolutely hilarious results, and we would just be brought to tears, especially after traveling for long hours in a car together. And then, of course, there were times when, especially us as kids, we all had to form alliances, against my dad. And sometimes it's that adversity that brings you closer together, right? And, even to this day, my brothers and sister and I are such completely different people. We work in completely different careers, but we have this incredibly strong bond. And I credit it back to those long hours that we spent traveling together on the highways of the 1970s and 80s is really the root of the strong bond that we share to this day.
The 1970s and 80s you mentioned, and we probably came along at a great time because those were the golden years for the American road trip, but not only the way you described them, but in so many other ways. There were good things that came out of these roads, like amusement parks were developed, national parks saw an increase in traffic, state parks. There was more recreation. We also started to see more things that I think hit close to home for you and me and the industries that we're in. Outdoor advertising took off. We saw brands take off, Coke, Pepsi, restaurants, as you mentioned in your book, Stuckey's and McDonald's took off. And one of the things that it just caught me off guard, and I read it because I haven't thought of this tagline since then. But you even talked about the burger wars in the 1970s when Burger King and McDonald's were competing. And in 1973, Burger King had an ad, a tagline or an advertising line. Do you remember what that line is?
Yeah, it was "Have it your way," of course. It was a stark contrast to what McDonald's offered, which was, of course, the speedy service system. That was the system that really put McDonald's on the map and revolutionized the fast food industry, because that speedy service was extremely effective in churning out vast numbers of hamburgers and meals as fast as possible that were by the 1970s being served up, of course, through drive-through windows. But the only problem with that system is that it didn't react, it couldn't accommodate custom orders very well. And so that's where Burger King kind of saw the weakness in that strategy. And so they came up with the famous "Have It Your Way" campaign, where you could get exactly what you wanted on your freshly flame-broiled burger, in contrast to McDonald's, who just wanted to serve it to you their way.
There were also other brands. There were hotels and motels, and there were so many things that went along with that. Howard Johnson's, Ramada Inn, Holiday Inn. Well, which hotel chain did your family stay in the most?
Yeah, we were big proponents of the Ramada Inn. My parents loved the kind of over-opulent foyers of the Ramada Inn. It had the vast seas of royal red carpeting and kind of Baroque style upholstery on the fancy chairs. And of course, it all centered around this magnificent chandelier, which hung down from the second floor ceiling of most of these Ramada lobbies. And so that was really the only thing that distinguished Ramada Inn from Holiday Inn, of course. But my parents were taken with it, and so we would always drive that extra mile to get to the Ramada Inns. But as far as many of the national chains, now there was a few like Howard Johnson's and Stuckey's that had been around since the 1920s and 30s, so they actually predated the interstate highway system. But of course, they also greatly benefited from the growth of the interstate highway system in the 1950s. And in often cases, especially in the case of Howard Johnson's, he was smart enough to foresee that families would be looking for a taste of the familiar in unfamiliar places. So he purchased these exclusive contracts to locate along places like the New Jersey Turnpike and the Pennsylvania Turnpike. And of course, families did appreciate seeing those Howard Johnsons along the way, and their 28 flavors of ice cream and their fried clam strips, which many people looked forward to then and still recall fondly today. So that was a very successful strategy for the growth of Howard Johnson's. Later on, during the 1970s, he added lodging in addition to his restaurants. And for a brief shining few years, Howard Johnson's was the largest hospitality company in the entire world. Of course, they suffered greatly with the rise of the fast food chains, the chains like McDonald's, like Wendy's, and their drive-through windows, which allowed families to just pick up a quick meal and keep traveling, as opposed to the table service, of course, that was offered at places like Howard Johnson's and Stuckey's. And so that really resulted in the demise of some of those great iconic chains in American travel.
Some of these industries thrived and then they declined with the same roads that helped them. Pop culture also had a fixation on these new highways at that time. We had a series of movies that practically glorified the roads, and it was almost because the roads themselves became a metaphor for freedom. In the 1960s, there was the motorcycle movie Easy Rider. And then in the 70s, there were those Burt Reynolds movies involving Smokey and the Bandit. How do you think pop culture glorified the roads?
In many ways. And of course, with the Smokey and the Bandit movies, and also movies like Convoy, of course, that also played into another craze that was taking place during the 1970s, and that was the whole CB radio phenomenon. CB radios had really been around since World War II. They were used by not only truckers, but service staffs, so that they could, have a cheap means to keep updated on, where to go for their deliveries and what time they would be back and so forth. So they were used by delivery staffs in that way. But then in the 1970s, with America's first major oil crisis in 1973, not only did truckers want to keep tabs, and then also as a result of that oil crisis, of course, we had the national maximum speed limit law of 55 miles an hour passed by the Nixon administration. So now all of a sudden people were they were forced to have to travel at 55 miles an hour as opposed to the 70 and 75 and even 80 mile per hour speed limits that were previously set on those same roads. So it was very frustrating for people. Of course, that meant a lot of people, including my father, wanted to push the speed limit as much as possible. And so in order to keep updated as to where law enforcement was and where speed traps might be set along the interstates, people started turning to these CB radios. Of course, there was that lingo, that CB jargon that kind of came along with the CB radios. It was kind of a combination of police 10 codes, military jargon, and of course some good old Southern slang. So now all of a sudden, you have everybody in America referring to, Smokies and Kojaks with Kodaks out on the super slab, and ambulances became meat wagons, and Pontiac Trans Ams were known as fire chickens. Everyday businessmen would close out meetings or business calls with a 10-4 good buddy, and they'd be urging each other to keep on trucking. And so it became this huge cultural phenomenon, and that, of course, created this and it was mirrored in some of the music and movies of that day. Of course, the song Convoy, a novelty hit, which I talk about in the book a little bit, became this huge #1 hit in many countries, not just in America, but countries around the world. It was turned into a movie, which also went to #1. It starred Chris Christopherson and Ali MacGraw, and then the Smokey and the Bandit movies. There were those movies with Clint Eastwood and his orangutan, too, where he was a trucker out there. And all of a sudden, millions and millions of people have these CDs in their cars. Even Mel Blanc, the voice of Bugs Bunny, and Daffy Duck would often get on the CB radio and entertain kids out in the LA area. Betty Ford, of course, the former First Lady, was known to use the CB radio when she was out on the roads. So it was this huge cultural phenomenon, and it manifested itself in many of the movies and music of the day.
Those highways more or less defined the 70s in pop culture, and we didn't notice it so much. It just happened. But then everything started to change. Airfares became cheaper, and you talked about that in your book. Cars became more reliable, so the highways started to change. Later on, we would get cell phones and GPS systems. And on August 1st, 1981, the Ratay family took its first family trip on an airplane. Can you describe that?
Yeah, well, it had been hyped up by my friends who had already been on airplanes by that time as this, incredible experience where you'd feel this huge rush of power as you barreled down a runway and lifted off into the sky. And of course, the thing they hyped the most and that I was looking forward to the most as, in 1981, I would have been about 12 or 13 years old, was the bathrooms that they talked about. They described this toilet that would, suck down your pee, and I had visions of the when you flush the toilet, it would immediately be expelled through this hole in the bottom of the airplane that I'd be able to, look down through the toilet and see, the farm field below and where my pee was going to fall. So that was one of the things that I, in my juvenile age, was looking forward to most at that time. And then when I actually went on the airplane, I kind of felt cheated by the whole experience. I mean, it was kind of cool that we could get on an airplane in Milwaukee and wind up in Washington, D.C. just a few hours later. But it just didn't feel like we deserved it, like we'd earned the right to be at that destination because we hadn't spent those long, arduous hours together in the car, and we hadn't seen so many of the cool and interesting things along the way that we always had in our trips prior to that. And so it was very much a feeling of melancholy that I had that we'd left something special behind, and I felt that even at that young age.
What do you do now with your own kids to preserve that tradition?
Yeah, well, we still go on plenty of road trips, and these days I'm making up for a lot of the ground that we did not cover with my family. As I mentioned before, we usually went south and east and stayed east of the Mississippi River, and I'm making up for that today. We're heading west.
How did the interstates influence America's mindset or its self-image?
Oh my goodness, I think it unified us as a country. Because like I alluded to earlier, all of a sudden it made this big country, once they were completed, so much smaller. Of course, the interstate highways were designed for speed, right? They eliminated intersections in favor of overpasses and underpasses. They were elevated, so it would promote rainwater runoff and prevent flooding. They were mostly 4 lanes. They had nice wide shoulders. Of course, they were restricted spaces, so unlike traveling on the 2-lane highways of the past, you weren't going to find yourself stuck behind any horse and buggies or anything of that nature. So they made America a much smaller place, and that made it easier for people to travel to places like Cape Canaveral and Washington, D.C., the historic Civil War battlefields, the boom towns of the West, and to get to places like Disneyland in California and the new Disney World in Florida. All of a sudden, all of these places that people really previously had never dreamed of being able to go to because they weren't going to get there by airplane because airfares were prohibitively expensive until deregulation of the airlines was passed in 1978. And I think it really brought America together, just as the traveling on the interstates brought families together.
Richard Ratay, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Tim. I really enjoyed it. I hope your listeners did too.
sure to check out our show notes for more information on everything that we talked about today. You'll find a complete bio on our guest, Richard Ratay, and you'll get more information on his new book, Don't Make Me Pull Over, An Informal History of the Family Road Trip. You can also listen to other episodes. And don't miss the next episode. You can subscribe to the Shaping Opinion podcast in many ways, and they're all free and easy to find on your favorite podcast channel and at shapingopinion.com. This is where we talk about people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Until next time, I'm Tim O'Brien.